Jeff Fuller back with you, presenting some interesting interviews and stories because I believe stories are to be heard, listened to, and help to make your story much better. You can certainly subscribe on YouTube, Jay Fuller Interviews. Also follow on Facebook group, and Instagram and Twitter. There is a little greater than icon at the bottom of the YouTube screen. If you want to subscribe, just click that, and you can certainly be a part. I'm excited about this evening's guest, and this is Cole Douglas Claybourn, CDC. Hey, how do you like those initials?
I liked it a lot more before 2020. That's for
Yeah,
sure.
kind of timely. Hey, so I first found you, stalked you by interviewing Jason Romano, Sports Spectrum. I'm a big sports guy, and definitely when they talk about sports and faith intersecting, that's kind of my wheelhouse. You just had a great interview on your podcast, In No Hurry. I believe it was with Matt Jones. And could you just talk about your affinity for sports, but how that podcast, that interview all came together?
Um, I have been a sports fan and into sports probably since I was cognizant enough to know what sports were. I grew up in Indiana, and so you can't be a kid in Indiana and not love basketball. And so obviously, I grew up. A lot of people like to remind me. So I lived in Evansville, Indiana, which is where the University of Southern Indiana is, and I went to all kinds of USI games. Bruce Pearl was the head coach there from
Yeah.
the first 8 years of my memory of watching basketball. And so I'd go to a lot of his camps, but people to this day, when I go back to USI games, remember me as the 3-year-old that used to walk around the stadium with the basketball. And I would go out onto the court at halftime and shoot baskets. And it would surprise you how many people still remember me for that anecdote. And so it's crazy. People I've never seen in 25 years remember me from all that. But I've been a sports fan my whole life, played basketball, baseball growing up, and then in high school, really actually in middle school, found tennis, and then in high school, found out that I was actually pretty good at it. And so, as hard as it was, I quit baseball, quit basketball. I'm only 5'7", so I wasn't really built for those sports. And tennis, just my body and the way that the game is played made a lot more sense to me. And so, kind of poured myself into that, and I think that was a good decision because I've been able to make a career out of it. I've been a tennis coach now for 5 years, and played at a pretty high level in high school. I didn't play college or anything, but I've always enjoyed that. But yeah, just been involved with sports. And you asked about Matt Jones. I went to college here in Kentucky. I went to Western Kentucky University. And so when I was in college, I think it was one year when Western had Kentucky on the football schedule, and he had me on his radio show to talk about, to preview that game, and
Hmm.
just have stayed in contact since then. And so he's a good guy, really, really awesome just person, I think. And here in Kentucky, I mean, I said this on my show, but I think he's probably the most influential voice in Kentucky. And if you don't if you don't live in Kentucky or aren't familiar with Kentucky, it's kind of hard to conceptualize that, because you might think he's just a sports radio show host. But to understand why he's so popular, you kind of have to understand the culture around Kentucky sports, particularly Kentucky basketball, the University of Kentucky basketball, and
Yeah.
understand why his influence is so big here. But Matt's a great guy. I was really happy to have him on, and I was hoping earlier last year that he would end up running for Senate, which he decided not
Right.
to. But he did explain in that episode why he chose not to, and it made perfect sense. But yeah, Matt's a great guy, and happy to be in a state where hopefully I'll be able to run into him a little bit more.
So he's definitely an interesting guy, and something about him that I found appealing was he is opinionated. He has no issues presenting how he's feeling, which I think is terrific. But sometimes, as a podcast host, as you are completely aware, you need to be a little bit more tactful, I guess, in your opinion. How do you balance that with interviews, with allowing the guests just to go off and share what they truly believe, passionate about, but you kind of need to temper your words or calculate your responses to those points of view?
Yeah, I try to remember that I'm bringing the guests on for my listeners to hear them, not to hear me. They can hear me every single episode, and I'll chime in whenever it's something that I really have an opinion about, especially if it's something that I'm knowledgeable about. But I bring my guests on because I want people to hear their story. It's probably the same reason why you have different people on your show. I try to introduce people in my world to people that I find interesting in my world, because in a lot of ways they intersect, but in some ways I'll bring on guests that people in my world have never heard of or don't know
Right.
much about. And so I want to, I want to let them do more of the talking. And, I got to interview, Matt Brown last week, his at Evangelist Matt on Twitter. A lot of people follow him, but that was one of the interviews where I'd ask a question and he talked for 5 or 6 minutes, and it was all great stuff. And I was like, sometimes I would interject, but I was like, you know what, he's saying great stuff. I don't need to interject on this. And so some guests, they're not as talkative, and I kind of have to fill in the gaps a little bit more. But I feel like I've been very blessed with a lot of really good guests that they all have something new and interesting to say that I don't really want to step in the way too much.
Definitely. And I know that the benefit for me is you build friendships, and then you just want your friend's story being told. And it doesn't have to be a big name, but the story is so important. I'm going to come back to this slide about the podcast, but in no hurry. Where is it? Here we go. You mentioned playing tennis and coaching tennis. Can you talk about how you've been able to use sports to really relate to people in the faith realm as well?
Well, I got to have actually. So this year our season, the spring season, was canceled because of the coronavirus, and I had all 6 of my senior girls players on my podcast because we didn't get to have a senior night. And
Yeah.
typically, I have a certain type of guest that I have on, and I wouldn't typically have high school kids on my
Right.
podcast.
Right.
But these girls, they were they were freshmen on my very first team that I coached as a head coach at the school. And so we were looking forward to this final season with them, and they didn't get to have it. And I just felt bad for them because none of them were going to play college tennis, and it was going to be my last season coaching there, because we had moved. And honestly, so Evansville is about 2 hours away from where we live. And
Mhm.
I didn't teach this past school year. I was working at a job that I could do from home. And so I was actually going to go back to Evansville and stay with my brother during the week and coach, and then come back down to Kentucky for the weekends just during those 2 months. So if that tells you at all how much that program and those kids meant to me, I mean, I was going to
Yeah.
do that. And, the awesome thing about that particular program, that school that I was at, Evansville Wrights High School, is we did have a lot of kids that were involved in their church. They were involved in Young Life. They were involved in FCA. They were involved in all sorts of ministries. And, we got to talk about faith a lot. And at a public school, it's hard because you can't force it down the kids' throats, or otherwise you can get into some trouble. And so you got to be
Yeah.
delicate with it. So, as a coach at a public school, you try to lead by example, and that involves, what you post on social media. That involves, just how you behave at practice. And a lot of those students had me as a teacher, so it involves how I treat people in class, how I handle myself in class. And so, when there weren't chances to, maybe do a discipleship event or a Bible study, I tried to lead by example and show, what Christ looks like through a coach. And so, I've really enjoyed that aspect of coaching. Obviously, I enjoy the competitiveness. I enjoy the strategy, especially tennis, where it's a lot of mental, mental tactics and that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. But I think the best thing that I've really enjoyed, probably more so than teaching itself, has been able to build relationships with my students, and especially my tennis players. I mean, that was the hardest part about moving. Was it wasn't just the players, but the parents I had relationships with too. I was very good friends with a lot of them, and it was a great community. And I think that's awesome. That's something that's awesome that happens whenever you're a coach, is you get to build those relationships, especially at an age like high school kids, where they're in the process of maturing, and they're about to head off to college and become young adults. And I just tried to be. I always tell people this. I tried to be the coach that I didn't feel like I had. And what I mean by that is, the areas that I would have liked to have maybe had a coach fill in some gaps,
Yeah.
I didn't feel like I had that. I try to be that sort of a mentor for them. And based on their responses, I feel like, we've been able to build that relationship, and a relationship that I think will last past just me coaching them in high school. I mean, they know that they can rely on me for mentorship, or to be, to write them recommendation letters down the road. And I just think if you're getting into coaching and your heart isn't in it for those kind of reasons, then I feel like you're doing it for the wrong reasons. And, I love to win just as much as anybody, and I hated to lose just as much as anybody. But, the thing that hurt the most about this season wasn't that we, didn't get it wasn't the fact that we didn't get to play the matches. It was the fact that I didn't get to be around those girls for practices, and
Yeah.
the extraneous stuff like bus rides and going out to dinner after matches, and just the fun stuff where you actually build memories. I mean, the matches, the wins and losses are great, but it's kind of those things that fill in the gaps that make those experiences worthwhile.
And it's definitely about creating that culture that a lot of people refer to, that whether you win or lose, at least you act and carry yourself with a lot of
Mhm.
character. Quick story for us. I am the assistant to the assistant. I'm the assistant JV girls basketball coach. The head coach allowed me to sit the bench for the playoff run because my daughter was on the varsity. I was actually spent a lot of time next to her on the bench. No offense to my daughter, but we made it to the championship game, first time in 40 years. And 2 days before that championship game, the season was canceled because of COVID-19. And you certainly feel for all of the players, but specifically, as you mentioned, the seniors. Can you talk about what it meant to you to have teammates and have coaches invested in you when you were a kid, and how you continue to look up to them now, years after that high school experience?
Yeah, I had, I took with sport like tennis, you take a lot of private lessons. High school coaches, oftentimes at a sport like tennis, aren't always the most knowledgeable when it comes to the sport, just because it's such a niche sport that a lot of times schools will hire people that they kind of have a passing interest in it. They know a little bit about it, but it's not like football where you can hire the best candidate that applies. It's just one of those sports where it's kind of hard to find qualified coaches. And so I definitely had good high school coaches, but I think where I got the most learning was actually from my private coaches, because they were USTA pros that know how to
Sure.
teach. And so what was really cool was my very first head coaching job. It was at a Catholic school in Evansville, and one of the boys on my team was about 3 years old when I was in high school. And whenever I would take lessons, I also would help teach lessons to the very beginners. And so this kid, Lucas, was in my class, and his father, Richard, was actually my private lessons pro from all the time in high school. And so it was really cool when I went back to the school to coach, and his son was on my team, and he would come and watch the matches. And it was just kind of a cool thing where it was like, man, you were my coach, and now I'm coaching your
Yeah.
son. And then like he and his son were both at my wedding. So it was just kind of like, that was a really cool moment for me, where it was like, you know, just the circle has kind of, it's come full circle, because not only was like, he was our neighbor, he lived down the street from us, and he's still at the same tennis club that he's been at probably for 20 years now, and it doesn't look a day older than he did 20 years ago. He's in great shape. But it's cool because now, like, when my players would come and ask, who should I take private lessons from, I always would refer them to Richard, because I was like, hey, that's who I learned from. And
Yeah.
I think that he's a great person. But this is that aspect, I think, is cool, where you can just kind of build those lasting relationships.
Oh, most definitely. Here in the Northeast, we say niche because we're
Yeah.
stupid like that. But hey, so I just want to talk. You mentioned that you were involved in journalism before you taught and went into coaching. Could you just talk about the opportunities you've had to write with Sports Spectrum or with Relevant Magazine as well? How did those come about for young writers? Is that just constant writing, submitting, and accepting failure, but not taking it personally until you had something published?
Yeah, so I went to Western Kentucky for journalism, and my career plan all along was to be a sports journalist, and did that in college. Did that. My first job out of college was in Owensboro, Kentucky, which is a small town, kind of in Northwest Kentucky. But I got to cover high school sports, some college sports, and it was about an hour away from my hometown, and ended up moving back to my hometown to work at the newspaper there. And I worked kind of as a digital producer. Basically, I was in charge of our website, social media, and I did a lot of writing, but it was kind of more on the news side. And I think I was in my mid 20s, and I got an offer at that time to help coach a tennis team in town. And I really, really enjoyed that. And it was about a year later when our company got sold. And journalism, even then, that 5 or 6 years ago, was a tough business, and now so it's even more a tough business
Yeah.
to be involved in as your everyday paycheck. And I started dating my now wife, and I just kind of thought to myself, like, I just don't know how I can support this as a full-time thing. And so I started thinking, what can I keep doing that would allow me to coach? And so I actually went back to school to get my teaching license and started
Mm.
teaching. But I've always loved writing. Writing has always been, I think, one of the skills that I'm most relaxed in. And also, I think, just, I feel like I'm good at it and I enjoy doing it. And so I thought to myself, how can I still use this skill, but do so more in a faith way, and try to help glorify God with the skills that I feel like he's given me. And I've talked about this a lot too. But when I worked in journalism, it was kind of a thing where when you work in daily journalism, it's kind of easy to fall into the culture of a newsroom. And
Yeah.
what I mean by that is it can get pretty angsty. It can get pretty testy. There's a lot of anxiety, because you're not getting paid a lot and it's a hard job and you're getting criticized, especially now by politicians and people in power. And even just the everyday person, they don't really understand why you're doing what you do or why you have to write a certain story. And I just felt like the reward for what I was doing was very little. And so I felt like, I want to go back into a field that I feel like maybe is more respected, that maybe has more of a future for me. And so I got into teaching. But then I wanted to keep writing. And so last summer, I had coffee with a friend of mine, who's a church friend of mine back in Evansville. And I was talking to him about how I wanted to find some places to freelance because I'm working on a book. And I know that if you try to submit a book without having a whole lot of, and I've written for newspapers and I've written for plenty of places, but not so much in the faith realm. And so I was like, I want to start freelancing for some faith-based outlets. And so a friend of mine put me in touch with Stephen Copeland, who is the co-author for Jason Romano's books and used to work at Sports Spectrum. And so I reached out to Stephen last summer and got in touch with him. And, we had a phone call just about book writing in general. And he put me in contact with Jason as well. And so I reached out to Jason last summer, actually, and John Ackerman, who is the managing editor at Sports Spectrum. And I was like, hey, I'm looking to freelance. And I think they were just in a different situation at the time and they didn't really need a whole lot of help. They just kind of like, hey, we'd love to have you, if you want to maybe submit some devotionals, we can take a look at those. And then I was moving at the time and I was coaching tennis in the fall. And so I just kind of slipped my mind. And so it wasn't really until January, I had Jason and Steven actually on my show in back-to-back weeks. And Jason remembered me, from the previous summer. And after that interview, he said, hey, I think we could use you to write for the website. Would you want to start writing for us? And so from there, since January, I've been writing for Sports Spectrum, and then wrote an article in their last magazine, which was one of my favorite stories that I've written. But for places like Relevant, it's such a big corporation, it's such a big brand that a lot of times, all of those, I haven't gotten paid for anything that I've sent to them. It's just kind of been I write something that I put on my website, and then I'll submit it to them if I think it's good. And there's a lot. I mean, more often than not, they just haven't replied to me. So fortunately, they've published a few of them, and some of them I felt like were actually really good that should have been published, but didn't get the feedback that I wanted. But yeah, I mean, you have to accept failure in it really in anything, but especially writing. There's going to be a lot of people that may not see your piece the same way. I'm running into that with my book. I've worked on this book for a few years now, and I've kind of been hesitant to send it off to a lot of agents because I know I'm going to get a lot of rejections, but that's part of it. And I think the best advice that I would have, and I'm definitely no pro at this because I get dejected as well and disappointed, but not everybody's going to value what you do the same way that you do, or even somebody else will. And, I've been talking to an author that I had on my podcast, and he said, all you really need is one agent. Because I've gotten feedback, very different feedback from a couple of agents about my book. And it's kind of like, or my idea at least. And it's kind of like, I don't really know which path to follow because I'm hearing two different things. And so, yeah, it's hard. You're going to get messages that you don't like. And I'll share an example with you here too. So when I was in college, my goal was always to cover Major League Baseball. Baseball has always been my favorite sport. Above any other sport, even tennis, baseball has always been my favorite sport. And so going into the summer in between my junior and senior year, I applied for an MLB.com internship. So every team would hire an intern for that summer that would help cover the team. And ideally, I think they wanted graduating seniors that could maybe stay through the end of the season. But I felt very strong about my capabilities. Growing up in Evansville, Indiana, I've gotten to know Don Mattingly, who's from Evansville, and so I was kind of able to name drop him a little bit. And I wrote what I thought was a really good cover letter, put together a really good packet of clips and my resume, and got down to the final 60. So they make one cut, and they have 60 finalists, and then they choose 30 from there. So I made it to the final 60, and I thought, well, I'm for sure going to get this. And then I'll never forget the email I got from the guy who, it was just one of those cold form emails that was like, thank you for your interest. We've evaluated all the candidates, and while your resume is strong, you decided to choose others at this time or something like that. And
Right.
I was like 20, 21 years old, and I just remember firing back like, well, what else am I supposed to do? Like, what do you want me to do? And he just gave me the whole like, well, you just need to get more experience. I'm like, that's what I'm trying to do with this
Right.
internship. So he was like, you should apply next summer. And I'm thinking, I'm going to graduate next summer. I don't want to apply for an internship. I want a full-time job. So I was really disappointed at that point, because I remember that summer and reading some of the work of the people that did get selected, and just thinking I could do a whole lot better than this. This is not very good. And maybe I was just looking at it through that lens at the time, because I'm sure they were good enough to be selected. But yeah, I mean, I was disappointed, and
Right.
there were plenty of jobs that I didn't get. And the reason why I got into tennis actually was because I got cut from the freshman baseball team. I didn't make the baseball team, and so but I turned that disappointment into that year, that spring of my freshman year of high school, until the fall of the next year when I played tennis, just dedicated myself to tennis and got really good at tennis at that point. So I think the way that you handle disappointment is kind of the mark of who you are. And like, you're going to be disappointed. There's going to be times where you don't make a team, or you don't get an article published or a book published, or whatever the case is. And I think it's just how you handle it and grow from it. Cause you just got to understand there's a lot of people that are submitting a lot of pieces of writing right now. And I mean, I try to think of it, I've gotten 3 pieces published by Relevant. That's really good. A lot of people submit stuff and never get anything published by places like that. So I just got to be thankful for the places that have wanted me to write for them. Like Sports Spectrum is awesome. Like, I'm so grateful for their ministry and getting to be a part of their team. And I don't get a chance to write as much as I'd like to, just because, I'm preparing now for this school year, and I work 40 hours a week. So it's hard to write all the time, but we do have a few other guys, some college guys that write for the website as well. So we kind of get to tag team and, share the workload a little bit, but it's cool. Like, there's some really cool stories I got to do. I got to meet Dan Orlovsky through Jason, got to have Dan on my podcast. And so it's just things that never would have happened if I wouldn't have been able to do those kind of things.
That's really cool. That's accolades to you for sticking with it, the grind, the grit, whatever they say. But it's really good. What's your book idea?
So a few years ago, I'd say my biggest faith mentor, he was the worship pastor at my church. And when I moved back to Evansville in my mid-20s, I started taking piano lessons with him, just because I wanted to learn a new skill. And really, it became more of like he was a mentor, a life mentor. I mean, I went through a lot of big changes in my life. I was dating a girl that I didn't really need to be dating. And he kind of walked me through that relationship and breaking up with her and getting out of that situation. And then, there was just a lot of other things going on in my life that, he prayed with me about and talked with me about. And so more so than that, he was just kind of a big faith mentor to me. But coming back from, his daughter was in the band at her high school, and they hit a deer on the way home, pulled off to the side of the road. And a guy who had been partying at an Indiana University football game that day was driving down the interstate and smashed into their car. He was drunk, smashed into their car when it was parked on the side of the road, and killed him, his 16-year-old daughter, and his mother. And then his other daughter survived the wreck, which is a blessing, but also just crazy that she had to live through that. So they were all killed on impact from this guy. And it was literally the night after one of my best friends got married, and I woke up to a text from my stepmom about it, and just fell to my knees and just felt a pain I've never felt before. And I was, at that point, had already bought my wife's engagement ring. I was going to propose to her in December. This was in November. And so the next month, really the next, however you define a season of your life, but it was a pretty dark season where I went through all the questions that you go through if you have a crisis of faith. The why. God, why would you allow this? Why would you take this man who devoted his entire life to serving you, and this man who was drunk gets to live? And even though he's in jail, like, he gets to live. And all those questions, like, why does this happen? And once I got past the grief of that, it was more so like just the anxiety and the big philosophical questions about life that we ask. And so the book it kind of starts with that anecdote, and that anecdote and that experience, that time of my life, plays throughout the whole book. But the book really is about, essentially how I developed a stronger faith because of that. But it's not just my story. It's really about, like, we're all going to go through suffering. We're all going to have heartache. And I think for me, it was the question of, not asking God, why does this happen, but understanding that it's inevitable. Jesus suffered on this earth. Jesus wept just like we did. Jesus felt all of the emotions that we felt. And I think as Christians, and especially non-Christians who aren't in the faith, we have a really hard time struggling with pain and with suffering, and we don't understand why that's a part of this world. And so my book is, I'm hoping to be a light of hope for people that, look, the question isn't why, but it's whenever you do go through suffering, here is how I was able to build a faith. The working title is Faith That Endures, Being Certain About the Uncertain. And so the whole idea was, as a journalist, I'm geared to find out the answers to everything. And I was going to come up empty on all of these questions. And I don't know if you know Barnabas Piper, but he's the son of John Piper. And so I've gotten to know Barnabas a little bit, and I had him on my podcast, and we were talking about his book called Help My Unbelief, which I think is, for me, it's the most influential book in terms of what I'm writing right now. And he has a line in the book that has always really stuck with me, and it's one of my favorite lines of any book. And he says, "We are finite creatures trying to understand an infinite God." And he basically goes on to say, we were not even created to understand everything about God or why everything happens. Like, we were not like, and for me, it was like, that relieves so much pressure from me, because I don't have to know everything. I don't have to kill myself with this search for answers, because it's going to always end up with emptiness. And so, and like, I've heard it preached before too, that, a lot of times people, even Christians, can make that quest for information an idol, and it can get in the way of having a relationship with God. And so instead of asking God, why, and being angry with God, and not that those are bad things, because I think they're great whenever they can lead you to a stronger faith. But, instead of doing that, what I was able to finally learn to do was go to God in my pain for comfort. And I think if anybody's ever read The Shack or watched the movie The Shack, I think it does a great job of showing that as well. And one of the lines from it, it says something like, God is speaking to the man, and he says, the way that you feel pain when your daughter was gone or was hurting, that's how I feel when you're in pain. And I think so many times we think of God as this puppeteer and just causing things to happen, and, writing this big play with us, when really it's like, that's not really how it is. Like, he's our father, and he hurts when we hurt. When we're in pain, he's in pain. And so much like we would go to our parents whenever we're in pain or whenever we're suffering, I think that's how I'm not saying I'm perfect at it, but that's how I have tried to prepare my heart and train my heart to go to God in those moments. The book is really just, it's about that experience, but it's really about faith as a whole. And that the whole idea is, whenever whenever you're wandering, whenever you're suffering, don't drift away toward God. Be anchored in God, and move toward God in those moments, because otherwise, you could fall away and miss out on the greatest promise that we're given.
No, I think that's good. Well, once it comes out, let me know. We'll get that and
Well,
promote that.
we gotta convince some agents and publishers to take it on first. So if anybody's listening who's an agent or a publisher and wants to get in touch with me about my book, you know where to find me.
It's interesting because I've heard it said that more atheists are born out of seminary, where people try to figure out and describe God instead of living by faith in any other place. And that's probably somewhat anecdotal, but I think it's very true as well. A question that's being posed to me more often than I probably would like is, Jeff, Dad, my daughter asked me with some of her friends, it's, you were adopted by a Christian family, grew up in a Christian home, so that is why you believe in God and have faith in Jesus. If you grew up in a different house, different home life, you would probably have a different religion or religious bent, slant, whatever. What would you say if that question was posed to you? You are a product of how you grew up, and did you grow up in a Christian home?
I think to some extent that's true, but I also I'd like to believe that once we get to a certain age, we're capable of thinking for ourselves. I mean, for instance, my wife grew up Catholic, grew up in a very religious, I mean, not her household or anything like that, but just growing up in the Catholic faith. It's different than what she believes now. And it's just, she grew up in more of a legalistic mindset,
Sure.
a religious mindset. the concept of grace was very foreign to her until she was really in college. And so, I mean, that's one example, but I think to some extent you can be. I mean, it depends on, I guess, the forcefulness in which it's shoved down your throat, or
Right.
how you're indoctrinated into it. But I know plenty of people who their parents aren't believers. Their parents might even be outspoken against faith, and they have discovered it on their own. I've also seen it the other way, where the parents were pastors and their kids were rebels. I mean, Barnabas Piper actually has a book out called The Pastor's Kid. It's all about being the son of a prominent pastor. And granted, he works at a church now, but yeah, I mean, there's stories, I think, on both sides. I don't know that there's a hard and fast rule. I grew up in a home where my father is a very strong example of a Christian man. We were very involved in church, but I also think that there's a catch-22 there, where people could say I grew up in church, and it's like, okay, what does that mean? Because
Right.
people, I know people that went to church their whole life that you wouldn't know it. And so, I try to say, instead of asking people, did you grow up in the church? I try to, ask people, like, did you grow up with the faith? Something that kind of implies more. Because it's like when people say, like, a lot of times people say, like, I'm a Christian. It's like that's how they identify,
Yeah.
almost like I'm white, I'm black, I have brown hair. It's like I'm a Christian. It's like that because they're told they're a Christian. But
Right.
I think you have to be careful with how you ask that or how people say it, because it's not always what they're trying to say or what they even mean, really. But yeah, I mean, I think just like you can grow up. I mean, I see this with students a lot. Their political views, or at least what they claim to be their political views, are influenced by their parents
Right.
or what they hear at their house. So yeah, I think it just kind of depends on how malleable the person is, how much ability they have to think on their own and think critically. And I think that's, like, for me as an English teacher, one of the skills that I try to teach the most with my students is that. And even as a journalist, we were taught to always be kind of skeptical of what we hear and find out the
Sure.
information on our own. And I think with anything, you need to be your own person, and figure out why you believe what you believe. And I think, like, for me, leaving my hometown to go to a college and be on my own was probably the best thing that I could have ever done, because
Mm.
I got and I just was forced to figure things out on my own. I
Yeah.
mean, nobody was telling me to do homework. Nobody was telling me to go to bed at a certain time. Nobody was telling me what to eat. And I think even as an 18-year-old, I can speak for myself, and I'm sure other people have had this experience. I figured out real quickly, like, hey, what my parents were teaching me was actually pretty accurate. And obviously people go the wrong way sometimes, but whenever you get out of that angsty teen mindset where parents are trying to control me, you realize they actually were making a lot of sense. So I don't have kids yet, but I can tell that I'm already going to have a lot of my father in me whenever I'm a father. So I think it worked out well. And I told my dad this too, that I've never had to worry about his character. I've never had to worry
Mm.
about who he is. I've never had to worry about him trying to be somebody that he's not. And I'm grateful for that example that I've had. And yeah, I think if you live in a home where maybe that's not the example, you can end up another way.
Yeah. Hey, that's refreshing. My son is 18. Our son is 18, and he's heading off to college. And so we're super excited for him. But then we wonder, like, do we really prepare him? Like, he has to make these decisions on his own, on
Yeah.
doing his homework and paying his bills and all of that. As an English teacher, journalist, former journalist, how has Instagram, Twitter, social media kind of changed the game? And I think there's too many lazy people that will just read headlines or like a photo, and then they kind of think like they're part of the entire movement or understand
Yeah.
everything that's taking place. How do you teach your high school students to go beyond just that bold print, eye-catching catchphrase?
Yeah. At my previous school, I actually taught I was in charge of the student publications, the yearbook and the newspaper, but I also taught journalism. So um, I loved it because I got to teach a lot of my favorite things about journalism, and a lot of that was media literacy and understanding what actually does fake news mean. It's not just something that you don't agree with or don't like. Like, there is a legitimate thing that is fake news, and this is what it looks like. It's not just something that you don't like. So yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to critical thinking. It goes back to, if something doesn't seem accurate, oftentimes I think Facebook is probably the worst place for that. I think it's just, there's so many fake things that I see on there that are just,
Right.
like, very clearly, or just, like, just not accurate, like, just, manipulating the facts. So it's hard because people have gotten very creative, where they can make things look legit. They can make it look
Yeah.
more legit than it really is. So I think teaching students, teaching really even adults, it's not just students, but adults and students, like teaching them like what constitutes an actual news article, what constitutes something that's real, constitutes something that's fake. I think it goes a long way. Social media, for where I see it impacting the most, and I'm guilty of this as well, and I've written a lot about this, I've talked a lot about this, but it breeds so much comparison and
Yeah.
so many self-esteem issues, and that's especially true for people that are in high school. That um, there's all kinds of emotions that go into a teenager's mind. They want to be popular, they want to be seen as cool, they want to be liked. And now, where when we were in high school, or when you were in high school, even like you didn't know a lot of times if somebody was having a party, you didn't really know what was going on unless
Right.
but now if people are hanging out, you see it all over Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter, and right away I was left out of that. And
Yeah.
so I think that, and then there's a lot of bullying obviously that happens, and so it can be a really dangerous thing. And so I feel for parents that have teenagers or any kids that are heavily involved in social media, because it can be a really dangerous thing. And my wife and I have had conversations just about ourselves, about like how we really need to not compare ourselves to people that we see,
Right.
because this is cliche, but yeah, it's like you see everybody's highlights, you see everything that they're doing that's great, and nobody's posting like, man, I've lost $500 today because I got a fine.
Right.
Nobody's
Right. Right.
talking about the bad things that happen. Nobody's saying, like, man, I busted my window doing something. It's like people show you like the great parts of their life. And so I think one thing that I did here recently, actually, I did a virtual writing conference a few weeks ago, and they were talking about like how, I don't know where the stat came from, but they suggested that teenagers and millennials and generation, is it Z? I guess it's Z, whatever the younger kids are
Yeah.
now. I
Yeah.
don't even know. But they are, I guess they are appreciating more genuine stuff. So like
Mm.
less filtered,
Right.
more raw things, which is actually pretty refreshing, because it's like, hey, we want to see who you really are. We want to know like what you're really doing. And so I hope we see more of that, because that's all that I ever try to be. I mean, it can be very easy. I've been writing quite a bit, kind of about this idea of like I do a weekly newsletter, that I send out a devotional each week, and I've been writing a lot about comparison this month. I guess it's July now, so I guess last month technically. But I've been writing about comparison, and one of the things that I think, the idea that stuck with me is that we put on this armor for a lot of things, and that can be to either protect us from something, or we put on armor to look like something else that we're not. And so I think, for teenagers, I think the big thing is that, they try to, and it's not just teenagers, really, it's me too,
Right.
but like we try to put on an armor to appear as somebody that we're not. And then, what was fascinating was I read a book. I think it was Daniel M. He wrote a book about comparison and some other
Mm.
topics related to it, and he basically said that people are actually like literally going into debt to be people that they think they should be on
Right.
social media,
Right.
and spending real money buying things that they can't afford to appear a certain way. And that to me is alarming, that people will do that just for their image. And so that's the hardest part about social media. Obviously there's great things, like you and I connected over social media. We never would have connected without it,
Right.
probably. But I think it's, yeah, um being careful of what you consume. And I think, to anybody out there, especially, I try to tell my teenagers, my teenage students this, just be yourself, be who you are, and be confident in who you are, because every single person has insecurities, and every single person has something that somebody else would like. And maybe they don't tell you all the time, but like, I'm sure people watching this that don't have a podcast or a show on
Right.
YouTube or wherever, they might say, man, I wish I could be Jeff Fuller, and I wish I could do this show, you know? So it's like, you just never know what people are going through. So I
Yeah.
think I just
No,
try to
it's
tell
true.
people, be genuine. Like I don't have, also, I don't want to take the time to curate my social media to look a certain way. Like I just don't care enough. So
Yeah.
I think being who you are, I think people are going to appreciate that more than anything else.
I agree with that. Yeah, Daniel Im's book, "You Are What You Do" and Six Other Lies. That's a really
Yeah.
good book. I really enjoyed that. I actually got to interview Daniel as well, which was a
Oh,
lot of
awesome.
fun for me. This website that you have, ColeClaybourn.com, and kind of with your writing, it's kind of a complex question. Maybe I'm not very deep, so maybe it's not that complex. When you write, are you thinking about writing to your high school self? Are you thinking about writing to your high school students? Are you just thinking about what would have helped you or what you're processing now? What's that process look like when you are writing? Is there an intended audience, or is it just what you're personally processing at the moment?
Honestly, most of it is what I'm personally processing. I wrote something last week that was one of the most vulnerable things I've ever written. And it was, we were talking about coaching earlier. If you go to devotionals on there, you'll probably see it. Actually, it might even be there it is, the most recent one down there with the hat on the bottom. If you scroll down a little bit, right there, I'm holding the trophy. And that whole article right there is all about um, insecurity. It's all about insecurity, and it's all about comparison and how as a tennis player, I never really amounted to what I wanted to be. I wanted to go to state as a player. I wanted to be an all-state tennis player, and that has motivated me. That has motivated me to be a better coach than I was as a player. But the point of that article right there was, I'm holding the trophy in that picture right there. At that point in time, I think my team was 21-0 at that
Wow.
point. We had just won the semi-state championship. We were headed to the state finals for the first time in school history, and we ended up going to the state finals. We lost to the number one team in the state, our only loss of the year, and it set all kinds of records for the school. And a lot of firsts for that tennis program, a lot of firsts for me as a coach. I didn't win Coach of the Year, and
Hmm.
I was bothered by it.
Yeah.
And it was like, for some reason, that overshadowed all the other accomplishments that I got to experience. And so that whole article is kind of cautioning people on, look, like, when your quest for the next thing is always on your mind, then you're going to be left empty all the time. And so
Right.
a lot of things that I write on there, I'd say almost everything that I write comes from an experience that I've dealt with or am dealing with.
Hmm.
And so a lot of times I'll have a topic that I want to focus on, and I'll think back to times in my life. Like I don't feel that, like, I still feel like I deserve the award, just but knowing what I did with the team, but it doesn't bother me. And it's like, I don't need that to complete me anymore. Whereas at that time I felt like, for some reason, I wasn't validated as a coach without that
Sure.
feather in my cap. Even though, like, most people don't care about that award, they were more impressed with the fact that my team was going to state. And it's like, I am too. And it's like, I just, at the moment, I was writing kind of about like the moments the emotions that I was processing. And it's like, we don't need to be feeling that way. So I'd say most of what I'm writing to, I don't know that I have a specific age group in mind. Um, I feel like I write mostly to people. I guess I write in my voice, and I guess to me, I guess I'm thinking of people in my own age bracket. But
Yeah.
I think everybody at every age struggles with comparison, and all of the things that I write about, I think, are issues that we as humans deal with. I've written about comparison quite a bit this year, and so I actually have an idea for a devotional book. I don't know if it'll turn into a full book or just a devotional book, but I want to do something all about comparison and identity because I think it's so relevant to people. But yeah, it's mostly just experiences that I've dealt with. A lot of it with grief through that experience we talked about earlier.
Right. Right.
Grief and comparison are probably the two things that I write the most about because, or just insecurities in general, because I think that's where I live the most. That's where
Yeah.
that's kind of where my heart and my brain are mostly. And so I think for me, that's where writing has been a huge catalyst, is that it helps me process. And I don't know how familiar you are with the Enneagram. It's kind of a big thing in
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
in our area. And you work at a church, so I'm sure you know the Enneagram. But so I'm a 4 on the Enneagram, with a really hard 3 wing. And so I'm not a big Enneagram guy, but I understand how that motivates what I do. And I can't not process my emotions. I just can't do it. Like, I can't keep those in. And so for me, the outlet is writing, and I put that out there. And it's honestly, it's not really to get congratulated. It's not really for people to say like, thanks for being so vulnerable. It's really like, this is just cathartic for me to
Yeah.
write it and share it with people, because I know that there are people that are dealing with this, and I want people to feel like they can empathize with what I'm going through, because a lot of times I'll write stuff that I haven't found to read elsewhere.
Sure.
And I know that if I can't find it, then somebody else might not be able to find it. And
Yeah.
so I'll write it hopefully for that person. And so thankfully I've been able to find a lot of good stuff about comparison this year. Daniel M. and then Luke Norsworthy. I read his book, Befriending Your Monsters, and our conversation on my podcast was a lot about comparison as well. So, I'd say those are the two main topics I write about, but it's all birthed out of experiences that I've gone through or am currently going through.
And I think that goes back to what you said about this new generation wanting more authentic, genuine statements from people, and just you're sharing what you're going through. On the Enneagram, my fingers are messed up. Maybe it's because I'm old. I can't do like a 3. I'm trying to find the camera. I don't know if it's arthritis or what, but I'm a 3. 3 on the Enneagram with a 2 wing, so a 3 on the Enneagram. So I can certainly relate. About just sometimes I'm just like diarrhea of the mouth. I'm just like, this is what I'm going through. And you're like, oh, ease up a little bit. But just knowing that just saying it out loud just reminds me of like where my identity is or should be. And that certainly helps. So the In No Hurry podcast, where did that name come from?
I sat for about 2 months trying to think of a name for my podcast. I knew last summer that I wanted to start one, and I was planning to start it in November. And I don't remember what song it was. It wasn't even a Christian song. It was just some kind of a song that came into my mind. That the phrase, the idea of "in no hurry." And there have been a lot of books that have been written. John Mark Comer wrote a book. Jefferson Bethke wrote a book. There were about 4 books actually that came out last fall that were kind of all about removing hustle and not being in a hurry. And I don't really know that it was based on those books at all. It just was kind of the idea that I was living in. And I always ask my guests at the end of the show, I ask them, what do you do to kind of slow down in your life to not be in a hurry? And just this idea that, we need to peel back. And I think, for me, it was something that I lived, because when I was a teacher, I was in charge of the yearbook. I was in charge of the student newspaper. I taught English. I was in charge of 2 committees, and then taught boys and girls tennis. And so in Indiana, the boys tennis season is in the fall, the girls are in the spring. And so it very much feels like it's an all year thing. And then in between that, I have the yearbook, which was the single-handed most stressed thing that I've ever dealt with. And that, so I never really had time to slow down. I never really had time to do the reason why the book project has taken so long is because I thought of it during my first year of teaching. And then I never had time except over the summers to think about it. And honestly, I spent the whole summer decompressing the previous school year. So mentally, I never felt like I had a chance to slow down. And so when I didn't teach this past school year, I was working actually for my father-in-law's company, and I had a lot more free time. And it was kind of like, I needed to create those spaces and those boundaries to not be in a hurry. And I didn't do it. I couldn't do it. I didn't know how to do it. And so the whole premise of the show is, we don't talk a lot about that idea just in general. It's kind of, just the motif of the show. But yeah, the idea was, we all live these crazy lives and we're told that being busy is a badge of honor. But really, I mean, look at COVID-19. We've all been forced to slow down. And I think not saying I want to live through this again, but I think that aspect of it, of where we've had to peel back from, what we maybe be distracted ourselves with, is a good thing. I think in John Mark Comer's book, he says that we are distracting ourselves into spiritual oblivion.
Yeah.
And I think that's so true, because I'm a huge baseball fan. I love fantasy baseball. And, I was so excited about the NCAA basketball tournament. Well, honestly, I've been pretty fine without sports on. I mean, granted, I'd love to watch sports. I watched the heck out of the NFL draft because there was not much else on. But honestly, it's I don't come home and turn on the TV and feel empty that there's no sports on. It's actually been nice to read more and to, go on walks with my wife and, watch some more entertaining educational TV shows and just do other things that maybe I would have distracted myself with. And on top of that, more importantly, spend more time with God. I think a lot of times we distract ourselves from reality or from things that we know that are important for things like sports, or, not that sports are bad or anything like that, but it could be bad if you let it distract yourself from what's truly important. And so the idea for that really was just, not being in a hurry, and more importantly, as Christians, recentering our focus, on Jesus and our relationship with God.
Yeah, that's really good. I really enjoyed Comer's book, the Ruthless Elimination of
Mhm.
Hustle. That was excellent for me, and I really enjoyed that. And what's interesting, quick story time for you from me, lucky you. But I was on radio, I don't know, 8, 9 years ago, a small, just local radio station, which was a lot of fun. But when COVID hit and the pandemic hit, and we had to quarantine, I was going crazy because I had all this free time, but I didn't have any bookends or boundaries. So I said, I'm going to do a morning interview and then an evening interview. And I know I need to get my work done in between that time frame. Because if not, I'm just going to be taking naps or splitting wood or just being bored and not getting anything accomplished. And that's just helped to focus on what does matter. And it's so interesting. And when you have rules and boundaries and lines, it actually gives you more freedom on the other end on what you know you can do. Now, this is where the story gets good, or at least for me. So I enjoy Netflix from time to time, and my friend said, "You need to watch Waco." Have you watched
Oh,
Waco on Netflix?
I watched the heck out of Waco. I think I watched at least. There was one night where I stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning. I think I watched 6 of the episodes.
I
That that
6.
is
I what?
that is my single handedly that is the historical event that I am the most fascinated in. I don't know why that is, but I have watched so many things about Waco. So I loved that documentary. I
So
guess it wasn't a documentary; it was like a mini series. But yeah,
yeah. So I'm 45. So I was a high school senior at the time that it actually took place in
okay.
93. And so I started to Google and look and watch everything I could find on Waco and what really happened. Because, well, when I was a senior in high school, I was pretty self absorbed. I think I still am. But it was just one of those things. And long story short, David Thibodeau,
I
the
saw
he,
that. Yes,
he I reached
I
out
showed
to
my
him.
wife that I showed my wife that picture last night when you posted it. I said, "Hey, he's gonna have." I said, "You remember the guy who Macaulay Culkin's brother
Yeah.
played on the movie?" I said that he's having the real guy on the
So I
show.
mean,
So
I just reached out to him and he said he would come on, and that brings it all the way back to me or to you. Is with In No Hurry, it's such a reminder that if we can pause and research and listen and take time, we can hear other people's stories, but we can tell other people's stories and
yeah,
learn from them. So the final question, that was a long intro, especially with the political and the social injustice taking place, how important now more than ever is it that we are in no hurry to truly make time to listen to people's stories that have endured such pain of social injustice or whatever the case might be? Do you have a new understanding, new passion to really listen and tell those people's stories?
that's a great question, and I think what you said is exactly right. I think more so than ever, especially white people, we need to sit back and listen to our black brothers and sisters or people of color that have suffered injustices. I wrote something right at the very beginning of right after George Floyd was killed. And look, I'm very aware that I'm a middle class white guy from Southern Indiana. Okay. I was raised in a middle class home. I've never really had to deal with a whole lot. But so my mother passed away when I was 14, but she was very dark skinned, like to the point where she looked like she could be black.
Hmm.
And she told me that growing up, people would call her the N word in school. And like she's white, so she never really had to deal with a lot of it. But it was like crazy that like just because her skin was darker, she was already getting that kind of hatred toward her. And so it hit me, when this all happened, and there was something about this particular event, and I think we've seen it since then, but really at the very beginning, it felt different. Like we had obviously like the Ferguson stuff several years ago. We've had Baltimore, we've had all kinds of other situations in the last 10 years. And obviously, go back to LA, Rodney King, 92, I think it was. There's been all sorts of things. But there was something that felt different about this George Floyd situation where it felt like finally a lot of people were awakening to what in the world is happening, because I think it's just so easy for us. And this is what I wrote on my website. I said something, basically like at this point, like we can't ignore these situations anymore. And I said a lot of people want these protests to be peaceful so that they can continue ignoring them. But the fact that they are violent and they're inconvenient, it causes people to have to stop and pay attention.
Right.
And, you know, as a white person, I'll never have to worry about, like, right now, if I go to the grocery store, come home, go anywhere I want to, I don't have to worry about what might happen to me. And that's even true as a male. My wife, like my wife, if she was going to go, first of all, I wouldn't let her, but like if she was going to go and get gasoline right now by herself at, what time is it here? Almost 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
Like, she wouldn't feel very safe. And it's just, we just have to be cognizant of, the privileges that we do have. And I think like the term white privilege has now become weaponized and politicized. And I didn't really understand it in my early 20s. When people say, white privilege, they're not always saying it as a pejorative. They're basically, I think sometimes they're saying it as a caution. Like, you need to be aware that you have certain privileges that our Black brothers and sisters don't have. And whenever they're trying to tell you about what they're experiencing, and your first response is, well, but, or, well, actually, like, that automatically dismisses the
Yeah.
experiences that they're going through. I will never understand fully what my Black brothers and sisters go through. I will never understand that. I mean, think about, like, you're probably, I assume you're an NFL fan. They have the
Yeah.
Rooney
Yeah.
Rule. All
Yeah.
right, so they have to interview a minority candidate for every head coaching opportunity. How many head coaches in the NFL in the last even 10 years have been minorities?
Right.
Very few.
Right.
And Romeo Cornell, who coached for a while at Western Kentucky, I couldn't ever find this number, but he has interviewed for more head coaching jobs than I think than any other football coach, and has gotten none of them. And so basically, he knows more often than not, he's going into this interview so that they can check off a box that they
Yeah.
interviewed a minority candidate, because he's qualified enough and he's good enough of a coach that it looks like they're doing their due diligence, and they're like, no, he's good. We want to
Right.
interview him. I mean, I think it's pretty apparent at this point that a lot of times they're just checking off a box. And so the fact that Black coaches, or even any minority coaches, Asian coaches, Native American coaches, they have to deal with that, where they don't really know for sure if they're in the interview because they're actually interested in them, or if they're just there to check off a box. And like, as a white male, never something that I'll have to deal with.
Yeah.
And so I think we, definitely, as white people, or as anybody who's lived a life that hasn't really experienced injustice, when somebody is telling you about an injustice that they or a loved one has experienced, I think before we write them off, or before we just automatically dismiss them or think that they're exaggerating, I think we do need to pause and listen and understand, like, look, there's some truth to what they're saying. And I don't think racism ever went away. I mean, I used to remember thinking in elementary school, like, man, that must have been really bad when racism was a thing.
Yeah.
Well, that was in the 90s when I was in
Yeah.
elementary school. And I'm thinking, like, I always thought to myself, how would I have handled it if I would have lived in the 60s as a white male? Well, here in 2020, I think I'm figuring it out, how I can respond and how I would have responded. And so I think we need to stand with our friends that have suffered injustices, or it maybe not them personally, as a Black, if we have a Black friend, maybe not even a friend, just somebody
Right.
who is Black, understanding, like, hey, they deal with crap that we don't have to deal with. And it's really, I mean, I think minorities of all races in this country have dealt with a lot of things. I mean, even the Rodney King issue, if I remember correctly, was Asians and Black people were butting
Yeah.
heads in
Yeah.
in L.A. And it wasn't just cops versus Black people. It was, minority races were having issues with each other. And I think, just, as a majority race, as somebody that experiences privilege, like, being cognizant of that, and not using my privilege to an advantage, but using my platform to help people.
Right.
And so I think for me, like, this, even just for me, this has been an awakening thing. And I hope, especially for Christians, that's been a thing as well, for Christians to open up and realize, like, we need to do more to help this situation, because racism, it might be something that always exists. I hope not, but it might be.
Yeah.
And it's something that we need to be aware of. And rather than resorting to you talked about media earlier and fake news and that kind of stuff, I see too many people on social media that just want to write off everything as a fake or a setup or conspiracy. It's like we need to legitimize the people that are saying things to us. And that's how women have felt with domestic abuse. They felt
Yeah.
like they weren't
Yeah.
being heard properly. And so I think, as Christians especially, but I think in general, it's just a good practice before we open our mouth to talk, pause and just listen to what they're having to say first.
Oh, that's for sure. Hey, Clay, thanks so much for making the time and spending so much time with us. It's a pleasure getting to meet you and, yeah, utilizing social media for something I would say positive and just sharing this platform has been wonderful. Again, I do recommend the podcast In No Hurry. I listen on Google Podcasts, but it's wherever you can find podcasts. Just search that out. In No Hurry, Cole Douglas Claybourn. Cole, thanks again for making the time.
Thanks, Jeff.
And again, that's my interview with Cole. You can check out more interviews, Jay Fuller interviews on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and just subscribe to that channel and just be a part of the conversation. Be quick to listen, slow to speak. And I think it will be a truly better place that we are giving to this culture and society and growing ourselves as well. Hey, thanks all. We'll talk to you again soon.